All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into something pretty interesting and a little controversial.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic.
It's the Iglesia Ni Cristo,
Right,
the INC,
right.
and specifically their practice of block voting.
Okay, so we're going to figure out, is this, actually based on the Bible, or what else is going on here?
I mean, I've seen those headlines, about how influential their vote is, especially in the Philippines.
Oh, yeah, big time. You're probably thinking that 2013 senatorial election. Yeah.
Exactly, that's the one. Wasn't it like most of the people they endorsed ended up winning?
10 out of 12. It was pretty remarkable.
Wow. Okay, so we're talking about some serious political clout here.
Oh, absolutely. And to understand why, gotta remember, their voting base is huge.
Right.
Estimated to be around 4% of the entire Philippine population.
No kidding. That's a block that can swing an election, no question.
For sure. Politicians definitely pay attention.
Okay, but the INC says this isn't just about playing the political game. They say it's about faith, about unity, and obeying God. They even point to Acts 5.29, where it says, we must obey God rather than men.
Right, and that's where their whole hierarchical structure comes into play.
You mean like how they have that single executive minister who leads the entire church?
Exactly. They believe he receives divine guidance on who to support in elections.
So for them, it's not a strategy, it's a collective act of faith. Like they're submitting to God's will through their leader.
That's how they see it, yeah.
But some sources are, they're directly challenging that interpretation, especially the idea that this is, biblically supported.
Yeah, there are definitely some different perspectives out there.
They really dig into how the INC uses certain Bible passages, like 1 Corinthians 1.10 and Acts 15, to justify this practice.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit, starting with 1 Corinthians 1.10.
Right, what's the deal with that one?
Well, it does talk about unity, but the context is super important.
Okay, what do you mean?
It's specifically addressing internal church disputes, not like deciding who to vote for in a national election. It's about resolving conflict within the church community.
Ah, okay, so using that to justify block voting seems, a bit of a stretch.
To say the least. And then there's Acts 15.
Right, that's the one about circumcision, right?
Yep, so again, it's a theological issue, not a blueprint for unified political action.
So are these sources saying the INC is just, misinterpreting the Bible to fit their agenda?
Some of them go even further than that.
Oh.
They argue the INC is, cherry-picking from Acts 15, leaving out the verses that don't support their block voting stance.
Interesting. Like conveniently ignoring the parts that don't fit their narrative.
It definitely raises some questions about, how they're interpreting scripture to support this practice.
For sure. But it doesn't end there.
Oh, no, there's more.
Yep. They also bring up another passage, Mark 12.17,
Yeah.
where Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's.
Ah, that's a classic one. Often cited to support the separation of church and state.
Right. And these sources are basically saying if you intertwine faith and political allegiance through block voting, doesn't that contradict what Jesus is saying there?
It's definitely another layer to this whole debate.
For sure. But it's not just about theological arguments, right? There's actual research into how this plays out in the real world.
Oh, yeah, there's some really interesting stuff out there.
I remember reading about some academic study that looked at the INC's endorsements, like in the 2004 and 2010 Philippine elections.
Right. And they use statistical analysis to figure out, does the INC actually influence how their members vote?
And what did they find?
Well, the answer is yes, they definitely do.
Okay, not surprising. But I'm guessing there's more to it than that.
There is. See, the study also found that the INC often endorses candidates who are already likely to win, just based on things like popularity or name recognition.
So it's less about divine revelation and more about, playing the odds?
It does seem that way, which adds a whole other dimension to this. Maybe the INC is just as concerned with their own influence, their political leverage, as they are with any spiritual imperative.
That makes a lot of sense. But from what I've read, it's not all, happy, clappy unity within the INC. There are some pretty critical voices out there.
Oh, for sure. Especially from ex-members and critics.
Right. And they seem pretty concerned about the INC's, let's just say, their methods.
Yeah, they're worried about the potential for suppressing dissent. If you criticize the block voting doctrine, you might face some serious consequences.
That's so much for unity, huh?
Right. And some of these critics are even accusing the INC of using their voting power to, get favors from politicians, even influence legal cases.
Whoa. Okay, so now we're talking about some potentially unethical behavior.
Definitely raises some red flags. Because if that's happening, it means this block voting could be used to advance the INC's interests, maybe even at the cost of individual members' freedom.
This is getting pretty complex. We've got these biblical arguments, these concerns about political maneuvering, even allegations of silencing critics.
It's a lot to unpack, and we need to understand how the INC itself explains what they're doing, how they make these decisions about who to endorse.
Right, because they do present it as a spiritual process, not just a power grab.
Exactly. And one of our sources sheds some light on that internal decision process.
Okay, what do they say?
Well, they claim it's not just the executive minister making a top-down decree. They say each local congregation has committees that analyze the candidates.
Ah, so it's presented as more collaborative, with evaluation happening at the local level.
Right, but here's the catch.
Uh-oh, there's always a catch.
The final say still rests with the executive minister, who, as we've discussed, they see as the ultimate interpreter of God's will.
So in the end, it all comes back to that hierarchy and the idea of unquestioning obedience.
Yep, it's a fascinating system. But with all these conflicting perspectives, it's easy to get lost in the weeds.
Totally.
Yeah.
So let's zoom out for a second. Why should all this matter to our listeners, beyond the specifics of the INC?
That's a great question, because it really highlights some fundamental questions about religious freedom in a democracy.
Like, how do we balance a group's right to practice their beliefs with the impact they might have on everyone else?
Exactly. And it also forces us to grapple with the ethics of religious authority in politics. Like, where's the line between promoting your beliefs and potentially coercing or manipulating people?
Right. It reminds us that we need to be critical thinkers, no matter who is trying to influence our political choices.
Absolutely. Whether it's a church, a political party, or even, a social media influencer.
We can't just blindly follow. We need to do our own research, think for ourselves, make choices that align with our values.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Because in a world flooded with information and misinformation, it's more important than ever to be discerning.
So true. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of our deep dive into the INC and block voting.
But we're not done yet. We'll be back with part 2 to delve into the historical context and see what this all might mean in the long run.
Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into the INC and their, block voting practices.
Picking up where we left off. Remember, this isn't just some, abstract theological debate. It has real-world consequences, especially in the Philippines.
Yeah, we were talking about how some sources point to instances where they've allegedly used their voting power to, pressure politicians, even influence legal cases.
Right, and there's one case in particular that stands out.
The Rovic Kanono case, right? That was back in, 2016?
Yeah, that's the one. Kanono was a vocal critic of the INC, and, well, things didn't end well for him.
He was arrested.
Yeah.
Right, on what seemed like, pretty trumped-up charges.
Exactly. Kanono claimed it was all orchestrated by the INC leadership to silence him.
And he ended up fleeing the Philippines, seeking asylum in Canada. He even cited religious persecution as the reason.
Which is a pretty extreme outcome. I mean, it makes you wonder, how far does this suppression of dissent go?
Yeah, it definitely raises some serious concerns. Religious freedom isn't just about being able to worship, it's also about being able to disagree without fear of reprisal.
Exactly. And when you factor in that political clout the INC has, things get even more complicated.
Right, because if politicians are afraid to criticize the INC for fear of losing those block votes, well, that creates a chilling effect on open debate.
Exactly. And it raises a bigger question about how we protect individual rights when a religious institution has that much political power.
Okay, so we've talked about how the INC justifies block voting and some of the potential consequences, but I'm curious about the practical side of it. How does this actually work?
Right. They endorse candidates, sure, but how do they get their members to actually vote as a bloc?
That's what I want to know.
Well, our sources describe a pretty organized system. The local ministers play a key role.
Okay, how so? Do they, stand up and tell people who to vote for?
Not exactly, but they do hand out sample ballots with the chosen candidates' names clearly marked.
Ah, so it's here's the cheat sheet, just fill it out this way, no need to think for yourself.
Right, and they really stress that voting this way is a matter of religious duty, not just a suggestion.
So there's a lot of pressure to conform.
Oh, yeah. And some ex-members describe a culture of fear within the INC. If you question the block vote, you could be ostracized, maybe even kicked out of the church.
Wow. So are people truly voting according to their conscience? Or are they just afraid to go against the grain?
It's a good question. And it's not just about casting a ballot either.
What do you mean?
Our sources say the INC encourages their members to actively campaign for those endorsed candidates. Like, they organize rallies, distribute materials, the whole 9 yards.
So they're not just endorsing, they're running a full-fledged political operation.
Exactly. That level of organization is what gives them so much influence. And it's not just national elections either. It goes all the way down to local races, mayors, city council members, everything.
So they're shaping the political landscape at every level, which makes that question about their motives even more important. Is this about faith, or is it about power?
It's probably a mix of both. And as we've seen, those motivations are so intertwined, it's hard to separate them.
Right, because on one hand, they're saying they're following divine guidance, acting in the best interest of their church.
But then you've got these allegations of coercion and abuse of power.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. And in the end, it's up to each of us to weigh the evidence and decide what we believe.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking is so important. We can't just take things at face value. We need to look at the rhetoric, the evidence, and think about the consequences.
For both the INC and Filipino society as a whole, because the stakes are high. I mean, is this bloc voting a harmless expression of faith, or is it a threat to democratic values?
That's the million-dollar question, and unfortunately there are no easy answers.
Nope. But as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, it really makes you think. When faith and politics collide like this, whose interests are really being served?
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the INC and their, shall we say, unique approach to voting.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, from, those biblical interpretations to allegations of political maneuvering. It's been a wild ride.
It has. But to really wrap our heads around all this, we need to kind of zoom out, look at the bigger picture.
All right, the historical context. You got to remember, the INC was founded in 1914 in the Philippines.
Which is what, relatively recent compared to Catholicism?
Well, yeah, Catholicism has been the dominant religion there for centuries.
So how did the INC manage to gain so much influence? I mean, that seems like an uphill battle.
Well, our sources suggest a few key factors. One is their emphasis on unity and obedience.
Okay, we've talked about that. But how did that help them grow?
Well, think about it. They've got this highly structured organization, very clear directives from the leadership. And for a lot of people, that's appealing.
You mean like people who are looking for a sense of belonging?
Yeah.
Clear spiritual guidance?
Exactly. And that focus on unity helped them grow really quickly, attracting followers who were, maybe seeking that kind of structure.
But it also created an environment where, well, questioning things wasn't exactly encouraged.
That's right. Going against the grain, criticizing the leadership, it was definitely frowned upon.
Which brings us back to bloc voting. Some scholars are saying it's not just a political tactic, it's a way to reinforce that core principle of unity and obedience. That's been central to the INC from day one.
Yeah, think of it this way. Bloc voting becomes a very visible act of obedience. It solidifies their identity as a group, sets them apart.
But that raises some, well, concerns, right? I mean, if you're conditioned to obey without question, couldn't that be exploited?
Oh, absolutely. And some of our sources are saying exactly that. They argue this whole system, the hierarchy, the bloc voting, it creates an environment ripe for abuse.
Especially with the examples we've seen, silencing critics, pressuring politicians, it makes you wonder about the long-term impact on the Philippines. I mean, on their democracy as a whole.
You're hitting on a crucial point. When a large group votes as a bloc, it gives them a disproportionate amount of power compared to, individual voters.
Right. It distorts the whole one person, one vote principle.
Exactly. And that creates an incentive for politicians to cater to the INC's interests, even if it goes against, what the broader population might want.
So it's not just about the INC getting their way. It's about the potential for, eroding democratic norms over time.
Right. It can stifle open debate, critical thinking. If voters are just following orders, they're less likely to really engage with the issues, consider different perspectives.
Yeah, it's like they're bypassing that messy but crucial process of deliberation. The back and forth that's supposed to be at the heart of a democracy.
Exactly. And that can lead to a less informed, less engaged electorate, which, has consequences for governance, for accountability.
It's a sobering thought. And it makes me realize this isn't just about the INC. Any group with that kind of bloc voting power, whether it's a religious institution, a union, even a corporation, it has the potential to, well, disrupt the system.
That's an important point to remember. Power, regardless of where it comes from, needs checks and balances.
Right. But in all of this, we can't forget about the individuals within the INC. They have genuine beliefs, devotion to their faith, their leader.
Absolutely. It's not necessarily about some, cynical manipulation. It's about deeply held faith and loyalty, which makes this whole issue so much more complex.
It does. We're grappling with the tension between individual beliefs and collective actions, between religious freedom and, well, the health of our democratic systems.
Yeah, it's a tough one. There's no easy solution.
But we can keep asking those tough questions.
Yeah.
Challenging assumptions, holding those in power accountable, no matter who they are.
And that's where you, dear listener, come in.
Right. What did you take away from all this? What sparked your curiosity?
What implications do you see, maybe for the Philippines, or even other democracies around the world facing similar challenges?
We encourage you to keep digging, explore different viewpoints, come to your own conclusions. Because ultimately, a thriving democracy depends on informed citizens.
People who are engaged, who think critically, who actively participate in shaping their society.
And on that note, we've reached the end of our exploration into the INC and bloc voting. It's been a journey, that's for sure.
We've delved into theological debates, political complexities, and ultimately, I think, the human desire for meaning and belonging.
As always, dear listeners, stay curious, keep exploring, never stop questioning. And until next time, keep diving deep.